Welcome to the session on Egyptian art, Part 3. The history of art of Egypt starts about the year 4000 BC. In accordance with the ancient Egyptian practice, the history of Egypt is divided into dynasties of rulers. The so-called ancient empire lasted from 4000 BC to 3000 BC, the Middle Empire destroyed by the invasion of the shepherds of the desert known as Hyksos from 3000 to 2000 BC, and the New Empire from 1700 to 1100. This was followed by a long period of decadence with the exception of a short period from 720 to 525 BC, when a renaissance took place under the aegis of pharaohs of Sais. This is known as Zeti period. In 525 BC, Egypt was conquered by the Persians, in 332 by Alexander, and then successively by the Romans, the Arabs, the Turks, the French and the English. The art and civilization of Egypt has long been considered as rigid and conservative by scholars. Plato had the opinion that Egyptian art had not changed in 10,000 years. It is true to some extent that the history of Egyptian art, which can be traced in the existing monuments, is marked by certain invariable characteristics. The basic patterns of Egyptian institutions, beliefs and artistic ideas which were formed in the dawn of their civilization can be seen repeating and reasserting itself until the very end. One may use the term enduring or continuous, as H. W. Jansen calls it, to describe this phenomenon. Moreover, one has to understand the principles of a well-established belief system which endorse such a style in art. For instance, in ancient Egypt, the pharaohs were considered not only as the supreme rulers but also as gods. This belief played a major role in Egyptian civilization and largely determined the character of Egyptian art. They also believed in life after death or immortality. Immortality was a privilege of persons with high ranks in society such as pharaoh, priest, nobleman, bureaucrat, etc. In order to ensure their life after death, Egyptians kept their dead bodies as mummies. In addition to embalming and mummification, they produced funerary images with the belief that if the body should decay, the soul could take up residence in an image. The society took great effort to preserve the body of a dignitary and to surround it with images of people and things needed to serve that person in the hereafter, servants, slaves, crops, animals and so forth. To preserve these goods and chattels, Egyptians built strong, impenetrable tombs. The surviving architectures of Egyptian civilization are tombs or temples, and the majority of the surviving painting and sculptures are from them. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus says that the Egyptians looked upon their houses as mere places of passage and on their tombs as their permanent dwellings. Our knowledge of Egyptian art is mainly derived from the enormous pyramids or the temples built above the ground and the burial chambers hewn in the rocks. The tombs of the rich are adorned inside with sculptures, paintings and bas-reliefs. The most impressive tombs among them were built during the Old Kingdom, that is between 2686 and 2160 BC. And the largest and most legendary are the enormous pyramids at Giza built for 3 pharaohs of the 4th dynasty. An early stage in the development of Egyptian funerary customs can be seen in the fragment of a wall painting from Hierakonpolis of about 3200 BC. The forms in the painting are evenly scattered over the entire surface. The human and animal figures show a tendency towards standardization, though they were still abbreviated signs. The large white shapes seen in the paintings are boats. They signify the funeral barges or the vehicle of the soul. there are figures of mourning women with their arms spread out in a gesture of grief above the topmost boat. Now let us go for a closer look at the style of Egyptian art. Style of Egyptian art. Egyptians made sculptures in stone, bronze and terracotta with varying sizes, from the colossal sphinx adjoining the great pyramids and the royal statues of Istanbul to small figurines. These sculptures represent gods and goddesses, often with the animal heads ascribed to them by Egyptian mythology. There are images of men, women and children singly and in groups, and animals both real and fantastic. The bas-reliefs and paintings are even more varied in subjects. By and large, they represent the pharaonic victories, ceremonials of religious worship, scenes of daily life, or the soul's journey to the land of the immortals. Landscape backgrounds are frequent, but as the Egyptians had never experimented the use of perspective, their views of space appear in the guise of maps on the vertical surfaces without foreshortening or differentiation of planes. On entering an Egyptian museum, one may be struck by the apparent resemblance between all the figures and may wonder that the art of a nation should have remained so uniform for centuries. But a closer look would at once reveal essential differences. Under the ancient empire, the figures are shorter and sturdier and are more directly inspired by nature. The wooden statue known as the Sheikh el-Beled, or mayor of the district from Cairo Museum, is an example of this spirit. Another example is a sculpture of the scribe in the Louvre Museum, which shows a great artistic skill in rendering the human form. In the Middle Empire, the figures begin to lengthen, the modelling to become more flaccid. The accepted ideal of this period seems to be a superficial elegance. Though occasionally charming, these figures are more often superficial and rigid. Takoshit, an Egyptian lady in the Museum of Athens, is a good example of this spirit. Under the new empire, these tendencies can be seen becoming more pronounced. The spirit, according to S. Reinach, is characterized by extraordinary technical skill subservient to a conventional style destitute of character. In Zayt epoch, the tradition of ancient empire again prevailed, encouraged by a national reaction against external influences. At this period, Egyptian art produced masterpieces such as the basalt head in the Louvre, which shows a greater degree of realistic perfection in its modelling. As we have already seen, the first impression we got while watching these figures is of monotonous uniformity. Then we may ask what the conventions behind this adherence to stylistic unity are. Conspicuous among these is what the Danish archaeologist Lang called the law of frontality. The law of frontality. All the figures standing or sitting, walking or motionless confront the spectator. The top of the head, the junction of neck and shoulders, and the center of the body are on the same vertical plane, and all the deviations from the vertical columns or any inclination to the right or left is forbidden. When several figures are grouped on the same pedestal, the vertical axes of their bodies are exactly parallel. Secondly, all the figures, whether motionless or walking, rest all their weight on the soles of their feet. No human figure is shown resting his or her weight on one leg and touching the ground lightly with the disengaged foot. Profile head. In the reliefs and paintings, the figures are in profile, but strange to say, the eyes and the shoulders are turned to the front. Such a disregard for realities is in fact an outcome of their beliefs. Chiaroscuro and perspective painting, whether executed on a flat surface or applied to statues and reliefs, is mere coloring without gradation or fusion of tones and without chiaroscuro. Instead of perspective drawing, figures are drawn in overlapping method. Logic of Egyptian style. A strong sense of order is the most striking feature of Egyptian art. They strived for clarity, not illusion, and therefore picked the most telling view in each case. What we evaluate as the frozen quality of image in Egyptian art is in fact suitable for the divine nature of Pharaoh. Ordinary, mortal's act, he simply is. The Egyptian style of representing human figure then seems to have been derived from the purpose of conveying in visual form the majesty of the divine king. The ceremonial slate palette depicting the victory of king Narmer can be considered as the oldest historic work of the art showing most of the features of later Egyptian art. It is also the earliest surviving image of a historic personage identified by name. Now, let me give you a brief overview of some important monuments and artifacts of Egyptian art. Pyramids of Giza. Mastabas were the standard forms of tombs until the 3rd dynasty. This is a squarish mound faced with brick or stone above the burial chamber. During the 3rd dynasty, they developed into step pyramids. The best known and probably the first is that of King Djoser, built of a traditional mastaba. Djoser's successors adapted the step pyramid to the familiar smooth-sided shape. During the 4th dynasty, the development of pyramids reached its climax in the famous triad of Great Pyramids at Gaza. These pyramids are believed to have arranged in the same configuration as the stars in the constellation Orion or the god Osiris, the mythical founder of Egypt. There are several smaller pyramids and a larger number of mastabas clustered about the 3 great pyramids. The Great Sphinx. Carved from the rock, the Great Sphinx stands next to the valley temple of the Pyramid of Khafre. The royal head, probably of Khafre, rising from the body of a lion, towers to a height of 65 feet. This great endeavor marks the high point of pharaonic power. Temple of Hatshepsut. The funerary temple of Queen Hatshepsut is an outstanding architecture among what have survived from the early years of the New Kingdom. It was built about 1478 to 1458 BC against the rocky cliffs or Deir el-Bahari and dedicated to Amun and several other deities. Temple at Luxor. The temple complex at Luxor dedicated to Amun, his wife Mut and their son Khonsu, and was begun about 1350 BC by Amenhotep III, but was completed more than a century later. Its plan is characteristic of general pattern of later Egyptian temples. The facade consists of 2 massive walls with sloping sides that flank the entrance. This unit is known as the gateway or pylon. It leads to the court, which is a parallelogram. We then enter a pillared hall which brings us the second court. On its far side there is another pillared hall. The temple proper begins beyond this hall, a series of symmetrically arranged halls and chapels shielding a square room with 4 columns. The entire sequence of courts, halls and temples were enclosed by high walls. Relief portrait of Akhenaten. The low relief portrait of Akhenaten shows a remarkable change in style and ideal of beauty from the traditional style. Its oddly haggard features and over-emphatic undulating outlines is indeed a departure from the old ideals of beauty. Not only the contours, but the plastic shapes also seem more pliable and relaxed. What distinguishes this style are the greater degree of realism and a new sense of form that seeks to unfreeze the traditional immobility of Egyptian art. We find these qualities again in the delightful fragment of a wall painting showing the daughters of Akhenaten. In order to get a clear picture of this new style, I would like to suggest a comparative study of Akhenaten's portrait with the low relief from the tomb of Ramses done some 30 to 40 years before it. However, the old religious tradition was quickly restored after the death of Akhenaten but the artistic innovations he encouraged could be felt in Egyptian art for some time to come. Coffin of Tutankhamun. An echo of Akhenaten style can be traced on the face of Tutankhamun, the successor of Akhenaten, as it appears on his gold coffin cover. Despite its sheer materials value, the gold coffin weighs 250 pounds. The exquisite workmanship of the coffin cover with the rich play of colored inlays against a polished surface is more impressive. Apart from the gold coffin, there is a painted chest from the same tomb showing the youthful king in battle and hunting scenes. While the king and his horse-drawn chariot remain frozen against the usual blank background filled with hieroglyphics, the same background in the right hand half of the scene suddenly turns into a desert. The surface is covered with stippled dots to suggest sand. Here is an aspect of Egyptian painting that we rarely see on the walls of tombs, and it is the result of Akhenaten style. Perhaps this lively scattering of forms against a landscape background existed only on the miniature scale of the scenes on Tutankhamun's tomb. It is interesting to note that they resemble Islamic miniatures done more than 2000 years later. With that, we reach the end of our short journey through Egyptian art. As an exercise, collect images of Egyptian art and try to identify their characteristics. Here we conclude the session on Egyptian art. Thank you.